At the heliopause gate, space looked orderly. Transit beacons pulsed as prescribed, white and amber sequences marking safe approach corridors. Cargo barges drifted between lanes of passenger liners and relief ships. The big arcs of the gate structure flashed blue whenever another ship slipped out of compressed space and unfurled into real coordinates. To the detached eye, it was a web of traffic and regulation. From the inside, it was barely contained panic. Captain Arun Karume stood at the main viewport of the HSS Dawncarer and watched a convoy slide in, hulls scarred and paint scorched. The ships had left colonies in the farward arm of the galaxy as those places fell, one by one, to wars that only made sense on tactical projections. The lives inside were crammed into hallways, cargo holds, anywhere air could be pumped and heat could be kept above freezing. Arun already knew the numbers before the docking report reached his wrist slate. His staff had been whispering estimates just by looking at the silhouettes and registry tags. Another 0.8 million, at least. He clenched his jaw once, then released it. This was not the time for anger. Anger, for him, was like the reactor in the ship's belly. Contained, useful when focused, catastrophic when it found the wrong path. He turned away from the viewport and looked at the traffic flow screaming across his command board. Docking queues, oxygen levels, quarantine flags. Every pixel represented a gamble with another life. Stack the Savanti medical ships on the inner ring, he said. Give them priority access to hulls with infectious markers. His operations aide blinked at him from her own console. We don't have clearance to. Then log it as a routing error and fix it in an hour, Arun said. We're not leaving an entire bay of people to suffocate while we wait for the right color of authorization stamp. He did not bother justifying himself further. Everyone on the Dawncarer already knew he had a habit of acting now and filing explanations later. It had saved between dozens and hundreds of lives already, depending on who was doing the counting. It had also generated 3 official reprimands. Those were filed, acknowledged, and now lived like dried leaves in some clerk's system. By 3 a.m., the ship was humming with the rhythm of triage. Shuttles kissed docking collars and disgorged lines of gaunt figures. The Radiance Triage Corps had turned entire cargo decks into processing corridors, medical scanners, decontamination mist, stacks of ration packs. Dr. Junri moved through it all with a rhythm that concealed his exhaustion. His back hurt. His eyes were dry. He had consumed nothing but stimulants and electrolyte solution in the last 0.9 days. He was also stubborn enough to outlast systemic collapse where possible. Next, he called, gesturing forward a family whose children were too quiet. Behind the medical urgency, behind the ration calculations, the politics pressed in. When Prefect Osali Dren's shuttle requested docking, the signal came wrapped in diplomatic priority. The Threxian Concord seldom bothered to send envoys to the Edge systems. Their presence here meant leverage was being prepared. Arun met Osali in a hastily cleared conference room, where the table still bore the faint ring of a sterilization spray. Osali's carapace armor was polished, his bioluminescent skin pattern set to a calm blue-green. His attendants arranged themselves in a precise semicircle behind him. To human eyes, he might have looked serene. Inside, Osali was irritated. He disliked disorder. He had grown within the Concord bureaucracy, learning each layer like a set of shells. Populations were supposed to move along designated vectors, not crash through improvised gates. The chaos of the heliopause traffic offended his sense of how the universe should function. Captain Karume, he said, his translator bead rendering the Threxian vowels into crisp trade. You have performed admirably, under very difficult circumstances. Arun recognized the cadence. He knew he was being placed into a story, the plucky local commander doing his best, so that decisions made above could look benevolent instead of expedient. We're managing, he replied, with help from Radiance and civilian volunteers, but our margins keep shrinking. Yes, Osali said. That is precisely why I am here. The Concord wishes to assist with the stabilization of the frontier. We can offer redistribution. In Osali's briefcase, a different phrasing glowed on his secure pad. Dumping masses out of sight was the internal term that Strategos Vekar Drun had used in their private conference. Osali agreed with the intent, if not the language. He preferred more elegant terminology. You have space in Sol, Osali continued. Your Mars is undeveloped, yes, but it possesses an atmosphere, however tenuous, and gravity within human tolerance. We propose to route the next major wave of displaced populations there. With adequate supplies, they can begin anew. Arun did not immediately answer. His mind ticked through the realities he knew, and the ones Osali was strategically not mentioning. Mars had a scattering of old research domes and a partially built environmental control grid. It was, in bureaucratic terms, a pilot project that had never advanced beyond Phase 1. It was not ready to sustain even a tenth of the millions Osali's proposal implied. We don't have infrastructure, Arun said carefully. We don't have settled governance. We barely have personnel on the ground. You have time, Osali replied smoothly. The convoy is still a transit away. The Concorde will, of course, provide logistical assistance. It is in everyone's interest that these populations are settled quickly. In the encrypted channel humming through Osali's implant, another voice spoke almost simultaneously, much more blunt. Strategos Vekar Drun's tone held the cool detachment of someone who thought in terms of force diagrams and economic maps. Push them to Mars Prefect, Vekar said. That rock is already a money sink for them. 6 million unanchored beings will tear it apart or become entirely dependent. Either way, it curbs Sol's ability to meddle outside its lane. When it fails, we offer a peacekeeping force and move a fleet in under the guise of humanitarian duty. Osali believed this would work. Historically, such strategies had. Displaced populations either collapsed under their own unsustainable weight or became docile in exchange for rations and shelter. Arun, not hearing those internal calculations but understanding the general shape of what was being proposed, felt something old and heavy stir in his chest. 6 million lives were being treated as a puzzle piece. He considered refusing outright, but he also knew the hidden threat. If Sol declined, the Concorde might route the refugees somewhere without even the marginal promise Mars held. Nowhere worlds, storm-swept moons, places where death would be slow and untelevised. Put it in writing, he said. Every ton of supplies, every ship, every promise of support. I want full documentation on what you are committing. Osali bowed his head a fraction. Of course. He intended that list to be suggestive rather than binding. Arun intended to treat it as a contract with reality. The heliopause incident unfolded 0.5 days later. Sensors at the gate recorded a subtle misalignment in one transit corridor, logged as a field phase anomaly. That was the official term used when a gate's calculated emergence point did not match its actual. To a customs observer, it looked like a minor, almost routine glitch. In truth, the anomaly was engineered. Command packets had been injected into the gate's control routines by Concorde specialists, subtly altering how destination coordinates were interpreted for a particular convoy. Instead of slipping through to prepped sanctuary worlds, 6.2 million displaced people emerged on a vector that curved inward toward the Sol system. The first message Arun received from gate control was perplexed, then frantic. Docking projections shattered. Assignments had to be torn up. Life support estimates became meaningless. Within an hour, the only feasible place to send that tsunami of humanity and alien kind was the one body in Sol that had unused gravity, marginal air, and land that would not politically explode if it was claimed for newcomers, Mars. The first time Arun saw the planet in person, riding down in a shuttle whose hull creaked under re-entry, he did not think home or frontier. He thought, they picked this because no one could argue. The red sphere filled the shuttle's forward window, swirled with high-altitude dust, dark with ancient basins. Thin atmosphere scraped at the hull, a faint whisper compared to Earth's roar. Here and there, the glint of old domes and antennae marked the work of earlier, more optimistic projects. On the surface, Daphne Morais was already cursing. Her hands were buried elbow-deep in an environmental regulator, its status panel blinking and accusing yellow. The regulator was a key node in the old Kuroda array, the underfunded dream to someday thicken the Martian atmosphere and stabilize surface temperatures. Years of budget cuts had turned it into a toy project, Just enough staff to keep the code compiling, not enough to make real change. Daphne had taken the job because she liked stubborn engineering challenges, and because Mars, in theory, represented the future. At 29, with more patents than most of her professors, and a temperament that oscillated between playful and uncompromising, she had imagined herself designing the first real Martian forests. Instead, she had spent 2.1 years keeping error logs from overflowing. When the emergency transmission from the heliopause gate arrived, she read it twice, then again, her lips moving silently. 6 million incoming, mostly human and near-human biologies, minimal infrastructure, high probability of systemic failure without significant intervention. Her first reaction was a cold, technical assessment. The numbers did not add up. The existing domes could not support even a fraction of that population. Power storage was insufficient, water reserves were laughable, the air processors were overdue for maintenance that could no longer be delayed. Her second reaction was anger, not at the people coming, but at the decision-makers far above, who had clearly decided that Mars could absorb the shock simply because it looked empty. She pulled her wrench free, sealed the regulator, and keyed the local channel. "More ice to all station leads," she said. "We're about to become the only thing between vacuum and a lot of people who didn't ask to die here. Shut down non-essential loads. I want every spare battery, every reserve tank, and every meter of HAB FlexLine prepped. We're in emergency configuration as of now." In orbit, Arun's shuttle dropped through thin clouds and extended its landing struts toward the primary outpost. The first sight of the domes confirmed what he had feared. They were built to housing standards for a testing crew of maybe a few thousand at most, not for millions. The shuttle kissed down with a jolt. Martian gravity caught every body on board slightly differently than what they were used to, but no one had time to dwell on the sensation. As the hatch cycled open, hot, dry air rushed in, thin and sharp. Dust swirled past, a constant in this world's personality. Beyond the ramp, figures in pressure suits waved them in. Daphne strode forward, helmet off within the pressurized zone, brown hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She recognized Arun from briefing packets and internal memos, the logistician who kept upsetting tables and then making them work better. "Captain," she said, "welcome to the end of the budget sheet." "Show me everything," he replied. "Assume I'm going to steal any good idea you have and multiply it by 6 million. Jun-Ri came down the next shuttle load, along with a dozen Radiance Triage Corps medics and a portable hospital that was barely more than crates and modular panels. As he stepped onto Martian soil, June thought, for a flicker of a moment, of the parks of his childhood, of trees and humid air. He pushed the image away. Sentimentality was a luxury he could indulge when people stopped bleeding to death because a corridor was 0.3 meters too narrow to get a stretcher through. He set his team up outside the largest dome, under a field tent that shook in the thin wind. Triage markers went down in colored tape. He reorganized the intake process he had been running in space to account for the dust, the lesser gravity, the limited shielding. Within 0.2 hours, shuttles began landing in waves. They came in all conditions. Corporate liners stripped of comfort furniture to cram in more bodies. Rusted freighters never meant for passengers. Talmar smuggling scows whose captains had never expected to make a legal landfall in their lives. From one such scow, Senu Ralk descended slowly. He had once been feared in the underways of half a dozen worlds. As a broker within the Talmar syndicate, Senu had specialized in making things appear and disappear. Weapons, luxuries, documents, people. Age and too many compromises had hollowed out the swagger, but the mind behind his deep-set eyes was as sharp as ever. He looked around at the landing pattern, at the lines of people stumbling into the thin air, and understood immediately the shape of the trap. This was not a sanctuary. It was a betting table, and the house had stacked the odds. He moved through the crowd with the ease of someone used to reading flows of power and desperation. When he saw Arun and Daphne speaking near a makeshift map table, he changed course. "Captain Karume," Senu said, voice rough but steady. His trade carried the faint rhythm of Talmar street markets. "You and your people did not plan this. That makes you dangerous. but also potentially useful. Arun turned, eyes already cataloging the older man. The way he carried himself, the way others unconsciously gave him a half-meter of space, the hints of tattoos peeking from under his travel-worn collar. "We're going to need useful," Arun said. "Who are you?" "Senurok," he replied. "Once, I managed flows of goods and information. Now, I imagine I'm just another refugee. Unless you're smart enough to see what this place will be without someone like me." "And what will it be?" Daphne asked, folding her arms. "A grave," Senu said simply. "Too many bodies, not enough structure. Your systems will fail. People will turn on each other, then on you. That is what those who sent us here are hoping for. They assume we will do their work for them." He studied Arun's face, gauging the resistance, the pride, the weariness. "Unless," Senu continued, "someone here can convince us not to die on schedule." In that moment, Arun understood something he had always known in abstract and now felt in the marrow. Leadership here was not about rank or jurisdiction. It was about refusing the script being handed to them. "Then we change the script," Arun said. "All of it. But you'll have to tell me what you see that I don't." They convened the first assembly 0.7 days after the initial landings. By then, the situation was already sliding toward disaster. The largest domes were over capacity. Lines of people sleeping pressed together in every corridor and open space. External tents were erected as quickly as fabric and pressure frames could be sourced or printed. Water ration lines stretched for hundreds of meters. Arguments spiked every other minute. Fists followed often. As dusk darkened the sky toward what passed for evening, Arun ordered all non-critical labor halted. Through the improvised public address system, his voice echoed inside domes and over exterior speakers. "Everyone who can stand and walk without medical assistance," he said. "Get to Dome 1. We're going to talk about how we survive the next month without killing each other." It was not a speech calculated to inspire comfort. That was deliberate. He needed people alert. They came in waves and clusters: human, Talmar, Savanti, Hrun, and a smattering of other species. Some glared at each other with old enmities. Some clung to family members, or what few possessions they had managed to keep. All of them brought with them the weight of loss. The dome's interior sounded like a growing storm, until June, standing near Arun, lifted a hand, and Radiance medics gently asked people to quiet down. There was no podium, only a stripped crate. Arun stepped onto it. He did not look like a Holovid hero. He was tired, dust-streaked, and the seams of his hastily donned surface jacket weren't even properly sealed. But he radiated a certain kind of steadiness, the same quality that had worn grooves into his reputation at the gate. "We have 6 million and change on this planet now," he said. "Give or take those en route." Murmurs rippled. Many had not heard a concrete number before. "We have bed space for maybe a tenth of that," Arun continued. "We have water reserves that, at current rates, will last 0.8 days, power systems built for test crews, not cities, and air processors that should have been overhauled 5 years ago." He let that sink in. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said. "If we do nothing different, half of us are dead in a week, more in a month. The people who sent us here expect that to happen. They will call it a tragedy and move on." He felt the room's attention sharpen. Anger stirred, fear twisted, but something else flickered at the edges: defiance. "I refuse that outcome," Arun said. "And from what I know of humans, and most of you, I don't think you like being told where you are allowed to exist." That drew a short bark of laughter from a Hrun warrior near the back. Hrun had followed contracts into slaughterhouses of war, and come back, always to find themselves treated as tools, not people. "We are going to organize," Arun said. "Not as one species under another, but as a joint emergency authority. Call it the Martian Emergency Commonwealth if you need a name. Every skill you brought here will matter. You will not sit and wait for rations. You will build, dig, grow, code, heal, and guard. If you can't do any of those, you will learn to do something else." Whispers flared. Authority? Who put him in charge? Arun heard them and did not flinch. "I am not here to crown myself," he said. "I am here to tell you the work that needs doing, and take responsibility for the decisions that will get people killed if they're wrong. If someone else wants that, step up now. Otherwise, we start in 0.1 hours. Engineering team, leads, front. Medical, security, logistics, front. Community reps, front. We're making work lists, and you're all going to hate me by the morning. Senu watched from the edge, increasingly intrigued. He saw the way different eyes turned toward Arun, skeptical, hopeful, resentful, and then gradually focused. This man was not promising safety. He was promising work and a target that was not each other. Daphne stepped forward, cheeks still smeared with engine grease. "I'm Daphne Morais," she called out. "Terraforming Systems. I know the Kuroda Array better than anyone else on this rock. We can't change the whole planet in a week, but there are buried systems and old projects you don't know about. I need people who aren't afraid of crawling through cramped spaces or getting zapped by underdocumented hardware. Congratulations, you're my volunteers." That got a few grim smiles, the kind that appeared in the face of shared insanity. June outlined the needs of medical care, community triage teams, basic training and shock response, a watch schedule to identify outbreaks of disease and conflict both. He did it with clipped precision, but inside he marveled. This could work if enough people believed it could. In a corner of the dome, a girl no older than 17 hunched over a salvage terminal, fingers moving quickly. Lale Novak had slipped into the assembly late. Her parents had been separated from her in the chaos of disembarkation. She had been directed toward a youth shelter that turned out to be a corner of a storage dome. Her reflex when terrified was to look for systems to fix. Machines obeyed predictable rules, unlike people. She had overheard Daphne cursing a few hours before about a locked access panel on a converter no one had the security clearance for. That same panel was now open, the converter humming more steadily. Its ancient firmware finally coaxed into recognizing its new load. Lale fully expected to be yelled at for unauthorized tampering. Instead, Daphne had stared, then laughed. "If you're going to break into my systems," she had said, "you might as well do it under supervision. Congratulations, you're conscripted." As Arun spoke of work and survival, Lale's attention was half on his words and half on the network diagnostics scrolling past her eyes. She could see the skeleton of the outpost's communications grid. Half-broken antennas, dusty fiber links, processors set to low-power hibernation for years. She felt the familiar thrill of facing a problem that was bigger than any exam or hackathon she had cheated sleep for back on Earth. This time, failing would kill people. That sharpened her focus more than any prize. On another world, Prefect Asali Dren listened to the first scrambled reports from Mars and found himself both annoyed and faintly impressed. "The human has declared some kind of ad hoc government," one of his aides said. "They are mobilizing work brigades, reorganizing labor, commandeering systems beyond their classification." "Good," Asali replied aloud, "for the benefit of observers. Initiative is essential in crises. This will reduce the burden on our own support ships." Inside, he recalculated. He had expected a faster descent into disorder. He would have to adjust the schedule of supply convoys and perhaps provide just enough aid to keep the situation ambiguous. Not a clear failure, not a clear success, just another managed catastrophe. Strategos Vekar Drun saw the same data and felt a different emotion, unease. He studied Mars on his tactical display. A red sphere marked with population density heat maps. A new cluster pulsed near the primary outpost, flickering as more bodies disembarked. He overlaid projections of resource strain, conflict probabilities, and political fallout. Unexpectedly, one of his internal models began to diverge from the others. It suggested that, given sufficient organization and a certain type of leadership, the refugees might not only survive, but become a self-sustaining, hard-to-control node of power on the frontier. He did not like diverging models. "Keep an eye on this, Captain Karume," Vekar said to his analysis team. "If this experiment starts to look like a precedent, we will have to take more direct measures." On Mars, no one could feel that distant calculation. They only felt the pressing need to fix things before they fell apart. The days that followed blurred. Daphne and her crews worked in 16-hour stretches, snatching sleep in maintenance closets. The old blueprints of the Kuroda array, which she had once read as a curiosity, became a hunting map. Here was a buried conduit that could be repurposed as a pressure tunnel. There, an unused cavern designed for early atmospheric experiments that could now become a fallback shelter. When she discovered the Hephaestus swarm schematics buried under an archival tag, her pulse quickened. The Hephaestus swarm was a construction frenzy captured in code and machinery. Hundreds of heavy-duty drones, capable of chewing through rock, extruding support struts, laying composite plates, sealing in air. It had been commissioned to carve out a network of subterranean labs and living quarters before funding evaporated. The swarm had never been fully activated. The risk of unsupervised tunneling on an unstable, partly understood world had given risk-averse bureaucrats an easy excuse. In the dusty cavern that served as the swarm's nest, Daphne stood on a grated walkway and stared down at rows of dormant drones. Their surfaces were coated in fine red powder, but their status lights glowed a low, stubborn green. "I don't like it," said one of her senior techs, a Savanti with delicate silver scales along his jaw. "The control software is half-finished. The safety protocols are a joke, and we don't have redundancy if something goes wrong. That's why we build new safety protocols," Daphne said. "We don't have time to dig by hand, not for what we need." "What exactly do we need?" the tech asked. She imagined the refugees above, packed into domes that were one impact or power surge away from catastrophic failure. She imagined them spread through miles of underground chambers instead, shielded by rock, living in pressure-stable space. "We need a city," Daphne replied, "and we need it yesterday." They argued operational parameters for hours, and then she brought the problem to Arun. In the temporary command center, inside Dome 1, with the hum of overtaxed air processors overhead, she laid out the opportunity and the risk. "If we wake up the swarm now," she said, "we can start cutting habitable space within a day. Tunnels, caverns, anchored structures. We can route power lines more efficiently. But if we miscalculate the load, or the software misinterprets an old flag, it could punch through to a CO2 pocket or undercut a dome. We lose structures, maybe lives." "How many, if it goes bad?" Arun asked. June, leaning against a bulkhead nearby, already knew where this was going. His mind had been practicing triage at a planetary scale since he saw the first shuttles land. "Worst case, a dome collapse could kill thousands," Daphne said. "Best case, we get everyone into stable, expandable underground housing before the next major storm cycle." Arun weighed the lives potentially lost now against the greater mass of lives lost later if they tried to muddle through with surface tents and patchwork. He was the sort of man who did not hide from numbers. The numbers here were brutal. "If we wait for perfect safety," he said slowly, "we let people suffocate in their own fear. Launch it, with as many human eyes on the controls as we can manage." Lale heard about the swarm activation from a snatch of conversation in the engineering channel. Her reaction was immediate and thrilled. Machines that dug cities. She practically sprinted to Daphne's control room, skidding slightly in the low gravity. "You said you needed someone who isn't afraid of underdocumented hardware," she said, panting. "I learned to code by taking apart illegal mesh networks in my housing block. Let me help." Daphne studied her for a moment. The girl's eyes were bright and bloodshot. Her hands were inked with notes in 3 scripts. She was scared, exhausted, and ferociously present. "You're on interface duty," Daphne said. "We've got legacy code in 3 languages and a user interface designed by someone who hated future engineers. You translate between the swarm and everyone else." So Lale sat in front of the Hephaestus console as the first power surge rolled through its circuits. She watched initialization routines, boot modules that hadn't seen daylight since before she was born. Error flags went off like fireworks. She swore under her breath and began patching. When the first drone stirred, metal limbs flexing sluggishly, she felt a jolt of awe. They rose like beasts waking from an old dream, cutting lasers, humming as they ran internal diagnostics. "Okay, old monsters," she muttered. "You're going to behave, or we're all dead." The swarm's first run almost proved her right. They had plotted a set of primary tunnels radiating from the existing outpost, designed to serve as arterial corridors. The code looked sound. The geology scans were outdated but serviceable. Halfway through the first excavation cycle, warning alarms shrieked in the control room. "Pressure drop in Sector 3, shouted a tech. "Secondary tunnel deviated by 3.9 degrees. Laleh saw the line of drone icons wobble on her display, veering toward a pale blue patch on the subsurface map. An ancient, frozen aquifer. If they breach that at this temperature, we get a flash flood, sublimation, and a whole lot of ruptured caverns," Daphne snapped. "Shut them down." "The Global Halt Command isn't responding," another tech said, panic creeping into his voice. Laleh did not think. She had practiced slipping past security walls since early adolescence. Here, the wall was not a corporate firewall, but an overcomplicated safety routine that refused to cede authority in the middle of an operation. She reached for a lower-level command set, hands flying. "Bypass the supervisor module," she said. "Drop control to manual on specific drone groups. If we can't stop them all, we steer them." "That's insane," the Savanti tech protested. "You'll crash half the system." "It's already crashing," she snapped back. In orbit, at 9:15 p.m. Mars local, a minor dust quake rattled the ground. One of the older domes stuttered as its foundation flexed. Cracks spiderwebbed along its lower supports. Inside, sleeping refugees woke to the sound of groaning metal. On the surface, June grabbed a helmet and sprinted toward the dome, his medkit bouncing against his hip. He could feel, as he ran, the weight of lives he might not be able to reach in time if the structure gave way. In the swarm control room, Laleh forced the drones to tilt their cutting heads, adjusting their trajectory by fractions of a meter. The code protested, flickering between error messages and grudging compliance. "Come on," she whispered. "You don't want to drown either." The aquifer appeared on her display as a curved, pale boundary. The drone icons skimmed along it, then, centimeter by centimeter, turned away. The pressure alarms in Sector 3 dropped from critical to stable. On the surface, the quake settled. The compromised dome held, barely. June arrived to find frightened families pressed together, eyes wide but bodies uncrushed. He exhaled slowly, then immediately began checking for stress fractures and microleaks. By the time the first Hephaestus-built cavern was sealed and pressurized, 3 days had passed since the arrivals began. It was rough and ugly. Raw rock reinforced with quick-cured composite ribs, air vents bolted in place with visible welds, temporary lights jury-rigged from whatever hadn't burned out. But when the first 100 families were led down the sloping access corridor into the relative safety of that hollow space, they wept with relief. They were moving from temporary shelter into the first tenuous hints of a home. The next days were filled with iterations. Hrun volunteers took to the excavation work immediately. The heavier gravity of their home worlds made Mars feel oddly light. Hauling reinforcement plates and setting up beam anchors was less strain for them than for many humans. They brought with them techniques for shoring up tunnel ceilings, born from centuries of mercenary work on marginal worlds. Talmar crews handled logistics with the ruthless efficiency of people who had survived in smuggling warrens. They repurposed fuel tanks as water recyclers, turned cargo netting into partition walls, and enforced ration lines with an authority that came, ironically, from a lifetime of evading official rules. Human farmers from failed colonies taught anyone who would listen how to coax life from nutrient baths and artificial light. They cursed at the limited spectrum of Martian grow lamps and adapted anyway, planting fast-cycle crops that would grow in the subterranean caverns. June reinvented his triage system again, this time for a community that was learning to help itself. He trained youths to recognize early signs of infection, dehydration, and shock. He set up neighborhood health points in each new cavern, simple kits with basic supplies and pictographic instructions. So even those who didn't share a language could stabilize someone until a medic arrived. He knew it was insufficient. It was also vastly better than what most refugee camps in history had managed. The mesh network that emerged across Mars had Laleh's fingerprints all over it. She mapped every functioning transmitter, every half-dead relay, and every device with a wireless chip that could be coerced into acting as a repeater. She flashed firmware updates, cheated power draws from redundant systems, and turned the patchwork into a resilient lattice. When this fails, she told her few equally sleep-deprived assistants, I don't want it to fail all at once. I want it to fail in little pieces that can be routed around. Her mind, under the fatigue, was already playing a longer game. She had seen how quickly information could change the mood of an entire dome. A rumor of new supplies, a whisper about disease, a story about violence. She wanted their channels to carry something else. Schedules, updates, successes. In the second week, someone in a Dome 3 tech bay posted a joking status. Day 14 of the 30-day miracle, still not dead. The phrase caught. By day 20, people were posting work tallies and little victories under the same tag. 30-day miracle, day 20. June's team just saved a kid with lung collapse. 30-day miracle, day 22. First lettuce, sprouted in Cavern 5. The phrase became a way of asserting that they were not only surviving, they were building. In orbit, aboard the Dawncarer, Arun tracked progress reports with a mixture of relief and dread. The Martian Emergency Commonwealth had coalesced not as a formal government, but as a dense web of working groups, coordinators, and community representatives. Arun found himself at its rough center, not because he sought it, but because when someone had to sign off on risky decisions, everyone turned to him. He held late-night link calls with Earthside USRA officials and Radiance administrators who worried about legal responsibility. He listened politely, promised to file necessary documentation, and then did what seemed necessary on the ground. He also, quietly, began to ask for different kinds of support from the ships and stations that could reach Mars.
Don't send us more food than you have to, he told the Dawncarer's supply officer.
Send us solar fabric, seed stock, and tools. Send construction-grade printers and raw feedstock. We can handle converting them. You're asking for less immediate aid and more capacity, the officer said. I thought you were on the edge. We are, Arun replied, which is why I don't want a colony of permanent dependence. If we show we can build, we might actually get taken seriously. And if we don't, every crate of rations is just a more expensive way to die later. The news that reached the wider galaxy came in fragments at first. A Savanti freighter left Mars with its holds lighter and its crew mines heavier. They had seen the caverns under construction, the exhausted but purposeful faces, the improvised signs reading Commonwealth Assembly, this way. Their captain transmitted a long, uncensored report back home. Within a week, Marshal Karak Vel of the Savanti Union was reading that report in his private office, the light from a distant star painting faint patterns on the floor. Vel had never met a human in person. He had seen images, of course, and read files. The stereotypes painted them as impulsive, emotional, and distressingly resilient. Watching footage from a Martian cavern where humans worked alongside Talmar and Hrun, joking between shifts and collapsing to sleep in neat rotations, he revised his mental model. There was a certain ferocity in how they treated adversity, not as misfortune to be endured, but as a problem to be broken apart and repurposed. He found himself admiring it, even as he considered the implications for balance of power. If Mars became a proof of concept, other displaced populations might demand similar autonomy. The Concord would not like that. The Union would be forced to choose between confrontation and complicity. He forwarded the report to a secure circle with a simple note. We may be looking at the birth of something new on our doorstep. Prepare options. The Threxian Concord's reaction carried less nuance. Strategos Vekardrun watched data streams from Mars and saw, with mounting irritation, every point where reality refused his models. The Martian Emergency Commonwealth was not fracturing as expected along species lines. Human pragmatism and the shared trauma of displacement had overridden many old animosities. The economy, such as it was trending toward productivity rather than full dependence. Local governance was improvising faster than external pressures could corral it. This was supposed to sink them, he said to Asali Dren in a confidential channel. Instead, they're building a platform. Asali placated him with soft words about eventual entropy. Privately, Prefect Dren also began to feel unease. His career depended on this operation being perceived as a careful, compassionate management of uncontrollable circumstances. If it turned into a story of conquest by neglect, and that story spread, he could be sacrificed by the very council he served.
"What do you propose?" he asked Vekar.
"We step in before they cross the line between struggling colony and symbol," Vekar said. "Symbols are harder to crush. I want authorization to deploy Silent Parallax." The term sent a small chill through Osali's carapace. Silent Parallax was a weapon and a policy tool wrapped in a single, deniable package. On paper, it was a field calibration device designed to limit escalation by disabling advanced infrastructure in unstable regions. In practice, it could reduce a thriving world to subsistence by wrecking its systems while leaving its people nominally alive. It's not designed for full-frequency media environments, Osali pointed out carefully. Soul is wired. If we use it, we must be certain we can control the narrative. Vekar smiled faintly. Control the field, and the narrative follows. We'll schedule it as a containment operation if their resource draw exceeds agreed thresholds. Officially, we will be preventing a catastrophic systems cascade. No one will argue publicly. On Mars, the Commonwealth had no way of knowing that its success was painting a target on its back. They only knew they were very, very tired. By day 30, New Asterion, so named in a spontaneous vote when someone painted the word on the wall of the first fully completed cavern, existed as more than a cluster of shelters. It had main corridors wide enough for emergency carts to pass each other. It had a rudimentary grid of numbers and letters marking sections. It had meeting spaces where community reps argued over resource allocation and security policies. It had, somehow, a bakery run by a family from a destroyed orbital station using yeast cultures they had smuggled out in refrigerated flasks. The 30-day miracle as a phrase had shifted from bitter joke to a marker of identity. On the 30th evening, small lights flickered in the corridors as people lit makeshift candles or projected holo ornaments from salvaged devices. It wasn't a formal celebration. It was a collective exhale. Arun, walking through one of the caverns, listened to the low murmur of voices and felt something close to pride, tempered by the knowledge of how fragile it all was. He stopped by a half-assembled habitat module where Lale was lying on her back under an access panel, legs sticking out, a field lamp illuminating the tangle of cables inside. "Do you ever sleep?" he asked. "I've heard rumors," she replied, not looking up. "But every time I go looking for proof, another transmitter dies." He smiled briefly. "You did good work with the swarm," he said. "And with the network. People are talking about the mesh like it's magic. It's just radios and stubbornness," she said. "And a lot of stolen bandwidth from systems nobody remembered existed." He hesitated, then said, "The world needs to see this. Not the magic version, the real one. The coordinate lists, the schematics, the arguments. I want to send a transmission that no one can claim we faked. Something other camps can copy." She slid out, blinking up at him. "You want to open source Mars?" she said. "That'll annoy a lot of important people." "That's a side benefit," Arun replied. "You think we can do it?" Her mind was already racing ahead. Bandwidth calculations, relay hops, encryption that could keep hostile edits out while still letting anyone listen. The words Second Dawn floated up from some half-awake part of her brain as a label for the project, and she didn't quite know why, but it felt right. "Yeah," she said. "We can do it, but if you're going to put your face on feeds from here to Savanti space, you'd better get some sleep and a clean shirt. Hero of the 30-day miracle should at least look like he owns a mirror," he snorted. "Hero, my ass. I'm just the one who keeps signing off on insane plans. People need a face to aim their curses at," she said, "and their hope." 1 week later, the Second Dawn broadcast went out. It began as a pulse from a refurbished high-gain antenna on Mars, relayed through the Dawncarer's comm array, bounced off the Heliopause gate's peripheral beacons, then scattered into 100 directions by sympathetic ships and stations whose operators had been quietly recruited. Viewers who opened the feed saw first not a rune, but a sequence of images: the red planet from orbit, the dust storms, the crowded domes. Then the camera dove underground, revealing the tunnels and caverns carved by the Hephaestus swarm, lit by jury-rigged lamps, filled with people working. Subtitles bloomed in multiple languages. Data overlays showed energy graphs, water recycling loops, medical outcomes. Schematics scrolled. How to build a sealed cavern from scratch with drones and recycled hull plating. How to set up neighborhood triage. How to get a mesh network functioning from scavenged hardware. Only after all of that did Arun appear, standing in a control room with scuffed walls, a coffee stain on the console behind him. He looked directly into the lens as if he were looking into the eyes of someone sitting in a cramped cabin on a different world. "I'm Captain Arun Karume," he said. "I was sent here to make a refugee intake work. Instead, I found us another future." He did not plead. He did not demand. He explained. He talked about the decision to activate the Hephaestus swarm and what could have gone wrong. He talked about the Martian Emergency Commonwealth, how it was messy and improvised, and how anyone could form something similar in their own camp. He talked about failures, the people they hadn't saved, the days when tempers boiled over. "This is not charity," he said. "This is not salvation. This is just work, hard work. But if you're in a camp where someone tells you your job is to wait quietly until the right person decides you're worth investing in, I'm telling you that's a lie." He invited them instead to demand tools, not promises. He published in real time the designs for their structures, their governance templates, and the list of mistakes they had made. "We called our first month here the 30-day miracle," he said at the end. "But there's no miracle. The miracle is that no one stopped us from trying. If they try to stop you, show them this." In a labor barracks on a Concorde-controlled asteroid, Hrun workers watched the broadcast on a flickering screen someone had hacked into the local entertainment feed. They saw Hrun fighters on Mars training community defense teams instead of corporate security squads. In a Talmar Enclave ship adrift in frontier space, smugglers paused their profit calculations and leaned forward. Some of them had relatives on Mars. Others simply recognized the glint in the eyes of people who were refusing to play their assigned role. In Savanti Union halls, the broadcast was officially labeled unsanctioned and potentially destabilizing. Unofficially, it lit up private channels with debate and cautious excitement. In the Threxian Concord, Strategos Vakar Drun clenched his hand so tightly around his stylus that it snapped. This was exactly what he had feared. A living demonstration that displaced populations, given enough space and tools, could organize independently of imperial oversight. Mars had become not just a problem, but a rallying point. The authorization for silent parallax came faster than Asali Dren had expected. The High Council, spooked by early reports of sympathy movements in refugee camps and labor colonies, approved its deployment with the bare minimum of discussion. The operation was coded as a preventive stabilization field test in a high-risk environment. Silent parallax was positioned at the fringes of Sol, under cover of a navigation array upgrade to the heliopause gate. Control pathways were routed through civilian systems to disguise their origin. The plan was simple in outline and complex in execution. When triggered, parallax would send out a cascading series of pulses that would subtly scramble critical infrastructure on Mars and its supporting orbitals. Life support systems would glitch, power grids would develop cascading overloads, mining swarms would misbehave. Not enough to scream attack to the casual observer, but enough to push the colony back into desperation and dependency. Marshal Karak Vel received a heavily redacted briefing about the operation from a Savanti liaison embedded with the Concorde's technical teams. He read between the blacked-out lines and understood exactly what silent parallax was for. The code phrases about limiting runaway militarization and ensuring safe operating conditions were familiar. They had been used in other contexts to mask the dismemberment of local capacities. Vel imagined Mars in his mind's eye, the rough-hewn caverns and corridors, the tired people who had just begun to believe they might not be abandoned. He thought of them not as abstractions but as candidates, however unwilling, for a different kind of alliance. "If we let this happen quietly," he said to his adjutant, "we will be complicit in setting a precedent that could be used anywhere, including against our own border colonies." "What are you going to do?" the adjutant asked. Vel's options were constrained. An open military interdiction would be tantamount to declaring war on the Concorde. Savanti voters would not support that over a human settlement on a distant, dusty world. I'm going to buy them time, he said, and trust that these humans live up to their reputation for stubborn improvisation. On Mars, Senu Ralk's Talmar contacts began to whisper of strange traffic near the Heliopause gate. Senu had never fully left the habits of a broker. Even as he helped organize food distribution in New Asterion, he maintained lines of information that ran in zigzags through merchant circles and ex-syndicate networks. He first heard about a field calibration array being installed on the gate in a half-joking message from an old associate. "Sounds like a new toy for the overlords," the contact had said. "Something to keep hotspots from becoming bonfires." Senu's instincts prickled. He had seen what happened before whenever powerful entities installed new toys near vulnerable populations. He shared the scraps of data with Lale, whose fingers began flying across her console. She pulled archived specs for known field calibration systems and compared them to the signal patterns her mesh network had been quietly sampling from space traffic. A discrepancy emerged. Too much power channeled toward a supposedly simple navigation upgrade. Control signals nested inside civilian data streams. "This is not a calibration array," she said. "It's some kind of remote infrastructure modifier. If you wanted to hit a whole planet's worth of systems without dropping a single bomb, this is how you'd do it." Daphne, when presented with the analysis, felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "What happens if it fires at us?" she asked. Lale's simulation, run in accelerated mode, painted a grim picture. "Best guess," she said. "Power spikes across the grid, life support going out of sync, habitat controls stuck at the worst possible settings, caverns depressurizing, air reprocessors cycling into failure modes. We've built in redundancy since the last quake, but this hits everything at once. We could lose tens of thousands in the first 0.1 days, and more in the chaos." Arun listened without interrupting. His mind flipped through possible responses and discarded them. They had no fleet, no weaponry that could reach the gate. Even if they could somehow physically destroy Silent Parallax, the Concord would paint them as saboteurs, endangering the entire system. "So we can't stop the swing," he said finally. "We can only blunt it, and make sure everyone sees who swung first." Lale understood immediately. Information was as powerful as any ordnance if it was visible and undeniable. "You want to expose the weapon while it's being used," she said. "Turn a technical malfunction into a televised assault. If they hit us and it looks like a random catastrophe, they get sympathy and leeway," Arun said. "If they hit us and everyone can see the shape of the strike, they'll have to answer for it. That might not save us in the instant, but it might keep every other camp from being hit the same way." Daphne's mind turned to her systems. "I can set the Kuroda array to manual override," she said. "We can pre-position teams at critical life support nodes, ready to cut them off the grid and run in island mode when the pulses start. It'll be ugly, but it'll keep pockets of the colony alive, even if the main grid goes insane." June, already thinking of triage, said, "We can stage med teams in those pockets, train more volunteers. If systems fail smoothly instead of catastrophically, we can keep casualty numbers down." They needed more than local measures. They needed to tie Silent Parallax's operation to signatures that could not be brushed off. Senu offered the last, risky part of the plan. "I still have people near the gate," he said. "They're used to slipping aboard ships where they're not invited. If you can give them the right payloads and echoes, they can tap the control channels. Make sure every command the Concord sends echoes out to places they don't want it seen." Lala was already assembling a toolkit in her head. Packet sniffers, data duplicators, spoofers that would sit invisibly on the edges of the Parallax control grid and mirror its traffic. "You're talking about hijacking their own instrumentation," she said. "Fine. Let's see how they like having their secrets turned into public logs." Arun reached out to Marshal Karak Vel through back channels woven during the Second Dawn broadcast. Vel, after a brief internal war, agreed to stall. "I can delay final authorization on technical grounds," Vel said. "Demand more calibration runs, more simulations. That will give you at most 0.5 days. After that, if you haven't made their trigger politically radioactive, I won't be able to stop it." 0.5 days is a lot, Arun said. We reshaped a world in 30. Vel almost smiled at the exaggeration, then realized it was not entirely hyperbole. Preparations moved at a pace that made the first days after landing feel leisurely by comparison. Daphne rewrote control routines by hand while lying on the floor of the Kuroda Array hub, cables snaking around her. Her engineers dashed between substations, installing manual cutoff switches that bypassed the grid's normal logic. June convened an emergency council of neighborhood med coordinators. "This is not a drill," he told them, eyes burning. "At some point in the next day, you may lose lights, comms, and air control with no warning. When that happens, you do not panic. You follow the manual procedures we've been drilling. You hand pump air cyclers. You triage by flashlight. You keep people from stampeding for exits that aren't safe." He knew they would be afraid. He also knew that people who had made it this far carried a capacity for resilience that still surprised him. Lale built a ghost. She coded a set of processes that would ride the incoming parallax signals like barnacles, parsing out every instruction and broadcasting them out through every channel still under their control. She arranged for those echoes to be recorded simultaneously in Talmar smuggling relays, Rune clan ships, Savanti monitoring stations, and even a few human customs nodes whose operators had grown sympathetic. Senu's contacts, slipping aboard a maintenance tender at the heliopause gate, plugged physical taps into junction boxes no one had checked in years. They moved like creatures born to the shadows. Because they were. If they were caught, the Concord would claim they were terrorists. They were terrified anyway, but fear moved them faster rather than freezing them. On the Concord side, Vekar Drun checked final readiness reports and nodded. "At my mark," he told the operators, "we will compensate for slight delays in council approval with a quick execution window. By the time they finish their ceremonial phrases, the operation will already be underway." He believed, as many in his position did, that decisive action, forgiven by later explanation, was preferable to cautious inaction criticized by hindsight. The moment came at 2:10 p.m. Mars local. Arun was in the central control room of New Asterion, surrounded by exhausted faces and humming equipment. Daphne was in the array hub. June was in a clinic cavern that had been reinforced with extra air tanks. Lale sat with a headset on, fingers already on the keyboard, staring at a cascade of pre-trigger noise from the gate. The first pulse hit like a fist, aimed at the kidneys of an invisible giant. Lights flickered. Fans hiccuped. Interface screens glitched, spewing garbage characters. Deep underground, some of the Hephaestus drones jolted and froze in place, their cutting heads spitting sparks. In the air of New Asterion's corridors, a faint pressure wave trembled as the life support grid momentarily lost sync. The difference between catastrophe and crisis lay in the preparations. Daphne slammed down physical switches that cut entire sectors off from the main grid, flipping them into isolated loops. Her manual overrides took over, feeding power from stored reserves into critical nodes. She felt as if she were taking an axe to a tree to save its branches while the trunk burned. "Sector 2 stable," someone shouted. "Sector 4 offline, but backups engaged." In the darkened dome where one of the older shelters still housed families, emergency glow strips ignited along the walls as battery backups kicked in. People startled, then clung to the light. June grabbed a portable lamp and moved through his clinic, checking on patients as equipment monitors blinked out and then returned with scrambled readouts. His training took over. He listened to lungs with actual stethoscopes. He checked pulses with his fingers. He barked orders to volunteers, who obeyed because in that moment, having someone to listen to was better than flailing. On Lale's console, data exploded. The neat trickle of pre-trigger calibration readings turned into a torrent of command packets as silent parallax fully engaged. Frequencies that had lain dormant lit up with rapidly shifting patterns. Encrypted signatures she did not fully understand stamped each cluster. She didn't need to fully decipher them. Her ghost processes did what they had been built to do, copied everything, tagged it with timestamps, and flung it outward. At the heliopause gate, hidden taps sent mirror streams down smuggler lanes. On Savanti listening posts, junior analysts gaped as casual monitoring feeds suddenly bloomed with alien command codes. In Rune clan ships, tech priests saw the fingerprints of directed infrastructure sabotage. On Mars, the crisis was still very real. Some domes lost pressure regulation entirely for 0.03 hours, internal temperatures swinging uncomfortably. In one cavern, a section of roof cracked as misaligned support systems compensated too roughly. There were injuries. There were deaths, even with all their contingencies. But Silent Parallax did not achieve its intended effect. Because of the Commonwealth's manual partitions, the power grid remained partly compartmentalized. The worst of the cascades fell into dead ends or were absorbed by sacrificial circuits Daphne had wired to burn out in place of critical components. The Hephaestus swarm, jostled by conflicting signals, entered a fail-safe state rather than chewing through inhabited rock. In the main control room, Arun rode out the waves with his jaw set. He could feel the tremors under his feet, hear the panicked reports mixing with the calm ones. He focused not on what they were losing, but on what remained intact. "When we come through this," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, "everyone will know who pulled the trigger." Lalé's systems confirmed it. As the second and third pulses rippled through the grid, response packets flew back from Mars to Silent Parallax, filled with status data. Those, too, were copied and rebroadcast. The signatures of the Concorde's control systems were unmistakable to anyone who had ever studied their architecture. Within 0.2 hours, independent channels across the galaxy began lighting up with synchronized logs, time-stamped evidence of a massive infrastructure disruption targeted at a refugee colony that had just spent 30 days showing the world how to build with nothing. In the Savanti Union, Marshal Karak Vel sat in a situation room, watching screens fill with a story he had half expected and fully dreaded. He could see the outlines of the Concorde's deniability strategy collapsing in real time. It was one thing to claim a malfunction. It was another to do so when a dozen independent observatories all had the same command logs. "We need to get ahead of this," he told his staff. "Issue a statement condemning unauthorized use of destabilizing technologies near our borders. Call for an immediate investigation under interstellar safety accords." "Won't that implicate the Concorde directly?" one officer asked. "That's the point," Vel said. "If we stay silent, we endorse this experiment. Next time, they might run it nearer to us." On Threxian channels, panic flickered behind closed doors. Osali Jaren found himself frantically rewriting briefing notes as Vekar Drun snapped at subordinates. The Strategos had assumed he could present Silent Parallax as a noble sacrifice after the fact, a regrettable but necessary intervention in the name of safety. He had not anticipated that his weapon would be hijacked into a public spectacle. "This leak must be contained," Vekar said. "Seize any station broadcasting unauthorized data. Flood the channels with fabricated malfunctions. We can still muddy this." But he knew, in the quiet, rational part of his mind, that the damage was already done. Once a story planted itself in a dozen different places, cutting down one sprout did little to stop the forest. On Mars, the pulses finally ceased. Systems groaned and then settled. The emergency lights that had come on, one by one, began to dim as main power trickled back into place. In New Asterion's control room, someone started sobbing with relief. Someone else began laughing, too high and sharp, the release of tension bordering on hysteria. Arun stood very still. He thought of the people they hadn't saved in this attack and felt each one as an extra weight. He also thought of the numbers they had prevented from swelling. He turned to the camera mounted above the main console. It had been rolling silently since the first alarm, at Lale's insistence. "Send it," he said. Lale routed the feed through the still-shaken mesh. It rode on the same channels as the parallax logs, an answer to an assault. The galaxy saw Arun again, this time not in a composed broadcast, but in the middle of a crisis. Behind him, screens still flickered. Technicians shouted status updates. The air had that edge of carbonized plastic that followed overloaded circuits. "This is Arun Karume on Mars," he said, voice hoarse. "If you're seeing this, you've probably already seen the logs. You know what just happened." He didn't raise his voice. He let the quiet convey the anger. "They tried to break our grid," he said. "They tried to turn this place into an example of failure again. They hit a planet full of refugees with a weapon dressed up as a safety initiative." He pointed to the status boards. "We held," he said. "Not perfectly, Not without loss, but we held because we prepared, because we shared control, because we taught each other how to survive without waiting for permission. He did not name the Concord directly. He didn't need to. Their signatures were already viral. If you are in a camp somewhere, if you've been told to sit tight and let the big powers sort out your fate, understand this. You are not an accident. You are not a nuisance. You are a threat. Because if you start building for yourselves, you make them obsolete in places they want to own. He leaned closer. They just showed you what they're willing to do to stop that. Remember it. Then remember that we're still here. The feed continued for as long as the network could carry it. Glimpses of June overseeing emergency surgeries by lantern light, of Daphne crawling out from under a panel, face streaked with sweat and grime, of Lale slumped in a chair, fingers still twitching on autopilot, of Senu Rock distributing water in a cavern where the pumps had held because some junior tech had nailed a manual override into the wall a day earlier. Across space, in laboratories, barracks, and bunk rooms, people watched and recalibrated their own sense of what was possible. In the camps ringed by Concord gunships, Talmar elders began quietly adopting Martian committee structures. In Hrun barracks, younger warriors argued for taking contracts that built things rather than only guarding someone else's walls. In Savanti civic halls, debates shifted, however slightly, toward recognizing self-governed refugee enclaves. The official shape of interstellar politics did not crumble overnight. Empires did not fall in a day because of a single broadcast, however compelling. But a crack had opened. On Mars, life lurched back into motion. The Martian Emergency Commonwealth's councils met in longer sessions, now that they had to negotiate not only resource allocation but also the inevitable arrival of new allies and opportunists. Recognition offers began filtering in from distant polities, each with its own conditions and strings. Some in the Commonwealth argued for accepting a protectorate status under the Savanti Union, trading autonomy for security. Others, energized by the Refuge Compact's whisper networks, pushed for a looser, multi-world alliance of displaced populations that would owe allegiance to no single flag. Arun listened, guided, and refused to let decisions be rushed by fear. He knew there would be more threats. He knew the Concord would not forget this humiliation. He also knew that in surviving Silent Parallax, they had proved something even to themselves, that they could withstand a blow designed to erase them and emerge bruised but unbroken. Daphne returned to the rhythms of engineering, now with more help than before. Young apprentices swarmed the Kuroda Array Hub, eager to learn. They asked her how to keep a grid stable under attack, how to build redundancies, how to improvise in the face of shortages. She taught them, sometimes laughing at the absurdity, sometimes pausing mid-explanation, as the memory of alarms sent a phantom chill down her spine. June expanded his community health model, exporting training packages to other worlds through Radiance channels. He received messages back from camps halfway across the sector. Blurry footage of local medics using Martian techniques to lower mortality after raids and storms. Lale watched the mesh network she had woven extend beyond Mars, knotting into other systems. Her code, once a secret weapon against a single threat, now formed the backbone of a loose, sprawling web where refugees could speak to each other without filters. Senu Rock found himself, unexpectedly, becoming a bridge rather than a shadow. Talmar youths looked to him for advice on how to negotiate with human committees. Human coordinators consulted him on how best to anticipate underworld opportunists. He was, for the first time in his life, using his talents openly for something that did not fill him with quiet disgust. Life on Mars remained difficult. The air was still thin. Dust still seeped into every unsealed seam. Work never stopped. There was always another cavern to reinforce, another system to stabilize, another community dispute to mediate. But in the caverns of New Asterion, children born under artificial skies chased each other through corridors without flinching at every alarm. To them, Mars was not a death sentence, nor a holding pen. It was simply where they lived. One evening, months after Silent Parallax had fired and failed, Arun walked alone through one of the newer tunnels. The walls were smoother now, lined with insulation and panels. Faint murals had begun to appear. Stars, faces, slogans from a dozen cultures. One read in large, uneven letters, "We are not a temporary problem." He stopped and ran his hand lightly over the paint. He thought of the path they had been forced onto, of the millions sent here as a convenience to others. He thought of the months of exhaustion and fear. He thought of the fact that, against rational expectation, they had turned a dead world into something that felt, in places, like a beginning. Above him, unseen beyond kilometers of rock and thin air, Mars spun along its orbit, carrying with it a quiet revolution. The galaxy had not yet fully decided what to do with this unexpected node of human stubbornness and interstellar cooperation. That decision would take years, perhaps generations, of bargaining, conflict, and further invention. For now, under the glow of newly installed lamps and the low murmur of a settlement at work, humanity and its unlikely allies simply kept building. They had been dumped at the edge of everything and told, implicitly, to disappear. Instead, they had taken root, and in doing so, taught the watching stars that some species, when pushed into the hardest places, did not break. They proliferated,